I was just a poor kid the world had forgotten, but when I was 14, she pulled me back from the very edge of death on a rooftop. I could not even break free from my father's grip as he tried to drag me into the abyss with him. I felt the weight of debts and absolute despair closing in on me like a toxic wave. It was her eyes, filled with a stubbornness that bordered on obsession, that pulled me away from the ledge and back to safety. Everyone eventually came to see me as nothing more than her most efficient and reliable manager. Only I knew the truth, that over the last decade, I had nearly given my life to shield her from a fatal car crash. I burned through my youth to fuel her rising career, turning my own existence into nothing more than footnotes on her itinerary. I eventually fabricated the lie of having a fiancé just to create a boundary, forcing myself to step away from her side. I did it because for 10 years, I had been the most loyal and devoted man in Olivia Sterling's world. For an entire decade, I acted as the engine driving her upward, transforming her from an obscure conservatory student into a world-renowned pianist. She became a household name across the globe. Then, at the very zenith of her career, I made the choice to walk away. People called me insane, but I was the only one who understood that this secret love I carried for 10 years had finally reached its expiration date. Not long after, a video titled "The Engagement of the World's Top Pianist" went viral across the entire internet. In the footage, Olivia Sterling appeared in a custom gown worth millions, draped in dazzling jewels, searching for me throughout the city like a woman possessed. Her eyes were bloodshot and filled with a frantic energy. On the day I had handed in my resignation, her long and elegant fingers froze atop the keys of her Steinway grand piano. She turned toward me slowly, her breathtakingly beautiful face masked in a quiet and hollow confusion. She asked why I was doing this. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the rehearsal studio, fighting to keep my voice from trembling. I told her that I was not getting any younger and that it was time for me to settle down. After a brief silence, I added that my aunt had introduced me to someone back home and that things were getting quite serious. It was a lie, of course, a small deception meant to ensure a dignified and painless exit. Olivia's fingers began to tap restlessly against the ivory keys, a nervous habit she had whenever she was agitated. A few jarring notes echoed through the studio, creating a melody that felt fractured and restless. Seeing her reaction stirred a sense of bitter satisfaction within me that I could not quite explain. After a long silence, she placed my resignation letter gently on the piano. She told me she could give me time off, but she asked me to reconsider leaving entirely. For a brief moment, I actually wavered. A voice whispered in the back of my mind, as seductive as a siren's call, telling me to stay and remain by her side forever. Logic struck me like a cold slap to the face, dragging me back to reality. I reminded myself that Olivia was about to be engaged to Ethan Harrison. Falling in love with a woman who belonged to another man was a line I could never allow myself to cross. My hand hovered in the air, but I could not bring myself to reach out and take the letter back. I explained that the life of a manager was too grueling and that I wanted something more stable once I was married. I cleared my throat to maintain my composure. I promised her that I would arrange a smooth transition and handle all the paperwork properly before apologizing one last time. Once everything was out in the open, her voice actually became softer. She said she understood and wished me a happy marriage. By the time I walked out of the studio, she had already retreated back into the sanctuary of her music. To her, I was likely nothing more than the most efficient employee she had ever employed. I sat in a lounge for a long time, staring aimlessly at a framed photo of one of her past performances. It was the first time I had ever allowed my mind to simply go blank. Usually, my days were a blur of chaos, spent either managing her tour dates or handling her personal affairs. I had been at her beck and call for years, expected to drop everything at a moment's notice to be by her side. I had been doing the work of 3 people by myself. The pay was incredibly high, and the money I had earned over the years was enough to buy a luxury apartment in Manhattan outright. Josh, one of the new junior assistants, Had to call my name several times before I heard him. I finally snapped out of my trance. Josh told me that Olivia wanted me to head over to the club to start preparations for the evening. Tonight's event was a homecoming party for Eva Bennett. Eva had just returned from a prestigious program at Juilliard, and her arrival had set Olivia's entire Facebook feed buzzing. The guest list for tonight featured the elite of New York's younger socialite scene. They were all people born with silver spoons, as arrogant as their family trees were long, forming an incredibly exclusive circle. They made an exception for me, however, because I was simply too good at my job. It was hard to find a manager who could soothe everyone's egos while ensuring an event ran without a single hitch. As soon as I arrived at the private club in Soho, I threw myself into the preparations. I personally oversaw every detail, from the vintages of the wine to the placement of the silver and the specific dietary needs of every guest. I ordered the staff to swap the champagne for soda since Mr. Hayes was currently sober. I also told them to raise the temperature slightly because Mrs. Vanderbilt was prone to catching a chill. I made sure they had the aged Darjeeling tea ready, as that was Eva's absolute favorite. As the sun began to set, the guests started trickling into the venue. Eva was the first to arrive and waved to me the moment she walked through the door. She asked me when Olivia would be arriving. I checked my watch and told her she was still at Carnegie Hall for a rehearsal and would be there in about an hour. Eva collapsed onto a leather sofa, looking incredibly pale and exhausted to her very core. I gestured for the staff to lower the music before bringing a cashmere throw over to her. I suggested she rest for a bit since the night air was getting chilly and the other guests were not expected for a while. She took the blanket from me with a faint, tired smile. She told me I should quit working for Olivia and become her chief of staff instead, offering to double my current salary. In a social circle defined by sycophancy and fake praise, my professional and grounded demeanor was a rare commodity. I offered a small smile and thanked her for the offer, noting that it was always good to have a backup plan in case I found myself unemployed. By the time the city was fully illuminated by the nightlights, the club had reached its full capacity. Olivia made her grand entrance in a breathtaking black evening gown, the clicking of her heels echoing sharply against the marble floors. She looked poised and elegant, possessing a beauty that felt almost untouchable. As I stepped forward to take her coat, a stray, ridiculous thought crossed my mind. I realized this might be the very last time I would ever perform such a mundane task for her. Once the drinks had been flowing for a while, I found the right moment to speak up. I raised my glass to the entire table and made an announcement. I thanked them for their support over the years and informed them that tonight would be my final event. The table fell silent for a moment until Eva's friend, Chloe, raised her glass to break the tension. She admitted that they had all assumed I had ulterior motives toward Olivia, but it seemed they were mistaken. Everyone knew exactly what she was hinting at. Before I took the job, several male managers had been fired on the spot for confessing their feelings to Olivia. After those incidents, she had insisted on hiring only women. Even then, a male assistant had made tabloid headlines for trying to slip her a secret love letter. That story had become a long-standing joke within their social circle. Another guest chimed in, saying they were surprised anyone could spend so much time around Olivia without falling for her. Olivia took an elegant sip of her wine, a faint and lazy smile playing on her lips as she quietly dismissed the conversation as boring. After the main dinner ended, a few of us stayed behind for a private drink. Eva casually asked Olivia if the rumors about Ethan Harrison being interested in her were true. My hand froze as I was holding glass. I stood there with a whiskey bottle hovering directly over Olivia's drink. After a few seconds of silence, she remarked that it was nothing more than a strategic alliance. She said that marrying him was no different than marrying anyone else in their circle. In their world, marriage was treated like a business deal, a merger of assets and social standing. Love was always the least important factor in their equations. It appeared she had accepted her family's arrangements without any hint of rebellion. I had met Ethan Harrison before, a rising star in the tech industry who was young, talented, and seemingly perfect on paper. From an objective standpoint, he truly was the most suitable match for her. I had once fantasized that she might find a different path in life. Reality, however, never bends to accommodate someone's personal hopes. The party lingered until the early hours of the morning before the guests finally began to leave in their town cars. Olivia's driver was the only one who ran late due to some sort of sudden emergency. We were left standing alone together outside the entrance of the club. The streetlights stretched our shadows long and thin across the pavement. These moments of solitude were always the most dangerous for me. I felt as though the emotions I had suppressed for years were on the verge of breaking through their restraints. Olivia just stood there in silence, the alcohol having softened the sharp, cold edges of her personality. Soon, her car finally pulled up to the curb. She turned to me and asked if I wanted a ride home. I shook my head and forced a polite smile, telling her that my fiancé would be picking me up shortly. She simply gave a small nod and climbed gracefully into the back of the car. As soon as the car disappeared, the world fell into a heavy silence. I ripped off my tie and leaned against the stone planter by the entrance. I felt a sudden, hollow emptiness regarding my future and had no idea where to turn next. A silent autumn rain began to fall, and the cold mist started to seep into the fabric of my suit. I stood on the corner trying to hail a cab, but getting a taxi in this exclusive neighborhood was nearly impossible. Due to roadwork, the driver had to take a long detour that looped back toward the club. Olivia had assumed she wouldn't see me again after our goodbye. However, she spotted me standing in the rain with my jacket draped over my arm, looking completely adrift. She was taken aback because she had never seen her usually composed manager look so vulnerable. When I was in the office, I was always in a perfectly pressed suit with my tie tied with absolute precision. She was used to men who tried too hard to look attractive by loosening their ties or showing off their physiques while acting indifferent. I had always been different from those men. It was my professionalism and my ability to respect her boundaries that had kept me in her inner circle for so long. As the car approached me, the driver asked if they should offer me a ride. Olivia's expression remained neutral as she told the driver to keep going. The thought of my supposed fiancé being late had already left a sour taste in her mouth. She felt that while I was brilliant at my job, my judgment in my personal life seemed lacking. Regardless, she decided it was none of her business to interfere with my private affairs. Across the street, I thought I caught a glimpse of Olivia's car passing by, but it vanished into the rainy mist a second later. I figured I was just seeing things. Someone walking through the Upper East Side in a downpour was a very unusual sight. My shirt was completely soaked through and my legs felt numb from the cold by the time a taxi finally stopped for me. When I eventually made it back to my apartment, the silence inside was almost suffocating. I was used to telling people that I had it all. I spoke of a warm family, a loving fiancé, and a huge circle of devoted friends. People often told me that I was living the American dream. The truth was that I had absolutely nothing. I had no family, no partner, and no true friends to call my own. Back in middle school, my father had been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, and his health declined rapidly after his surgery. One morning, my mother simply walked out of the house and never returned. She took every cent of our savings, leaving behind a dying man and a mountain of crippling debt. Once the initial shock wore off, my father became strangely peaceful. He continued his treatments in silence and would even manage to cook for me on his better days. I came home from school one afternoon to find the table covered in all of my favorite foods. My father sat across from me and gave me a very gentle smile. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of anxiety in my chest for no apparent reason. The food tasted slightly off, and I caught a glimpse of a new bottle of pesticide sitting by the kitchen sink. In that instant, I realized exactly what was happening. I learned that even a man on his deathbed could possess terrifying strength. He grabbed me so tightly I couldn't move until a sudden coughing fit forced him to let go. I scrambled away and ran as fast as I could to the roof of our building. My father followed me up there with tears streaming down his face, his arms outstretched toward me. His voice was incredibly hoarse as he struggled to tell me that the world was too cruel for me to face alone. His voice cracked as he begged me to go with him so we could be father and son again in the next life. My vision was blurred by tears, and I was so exhausted that I felt tempted to give in. I wanted to smell the familiar scent of tobacco on his jacket one last time. I thought that ending everything right then might actually be a relief since there was no hope left in my life. The wind was howling across the roof, making it hard to stay upright. The only warmth I felt came from my father's arms as he held me close. He gripped my hand with a terrifying strength and began leading me toward the edge of the building. Just as we were about to go over the edge, a pair of slender but incredibly strong hands suddenly snatched me back. No matter how much I struggled to get free, those hands refused to let go. I was dangling halfway off the building with the wind roaring below me, and the only thing I could focus on were her eyes. Her eyes held a light of absolute, stubborn determination. I survived that day, though my father did not. The person who saved my life was Olivia Sterling. She did more than just pull me back from the brink. She gave me a reason to keep breathing. I decided then that I would dedicate my life to her. I was consumed by a deep sense of guilt, feeling as though I had betrayed my father by choosing to live. I was a drowning man, and Olivia was the hand that pulled me from the depths. She became my only source of hope. When the paramedics arrived, I refused to let go of her hand while I looked up at her. I asked her how I could ever thank her. The 14-year-old Olivia looked down at me with a solemn expression and told me to just come find her in the future. From that night onward, my own life felt like it had been put on hold. Olivia was the only force that kept me moving forward. That night, the nightmares returned and replayed my past with the clarity of a film. I saw my father's ghost asking why I had abandoned him, and I saw the cold, unyielding gaze of my mother as she walked out the door. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat and with a throat too sore to even whisper. My thermometer read 101 degrees. Under normal circumstances, I would have taken some Tylenol and gone to work as if nothing were wrong. This time, however, I decided to call in sick. I needed a rest. I needed time to figure out exactly where my life was headed. When Olivia arrived at the studio and heard that I had called in sick, she immediately frowned. Her opinion of my imaginary fiancé plummeted even further. Leo, the new assistant, cautiously tried to fill my shoes and serve her a cup of rose tea. Olivia took a single sip without changing her expression. The tea was much weaker than the way I usually prepared it. She didn't say a word, but she set the cup aside and never touched it again. She actually hit a wrong note during her morning rehearsal. Since she knew the piece perfectly, she was able to recover quickly before anyone noticed. The studio felt too stuffy and the humidifier was set too high, making her throat feel dry. She couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong all day, but she felt a nagging sense that something was missing. It was the first time Olivia had really stopped to think about me as an individual. Normally, I was so efficient and unobtrusive that she hardly noticed I was there at all. I had always handled everything quietly and behind the scenes. I was like a gentle rain that nourished everything without ever demanding attention. It was as if I didn't exist, yet the moment I was gone, her entire world began to feel off balance. She scowled as she realized this was the second time she had felt this way today. She blamed my fiancé for trying to lure her most trusted employee away from her. Meanwhile, I spent the whole day struggling to figure out what my next move should be. I felt like a lost moth fluttering aimlessly in the dark, unable to find even a single ray of light to guide me. I returned to the studio the following morning. As soon as I walked in, Leo rushed over to me and whispered in a nervous tone. He told me that Olivia was in a terrible mood and hadn't even touched her favorite tea. He pointed toward the windowsill, where yesterday's cold cup was still sitting. I picked up the cup and took a sniff before turning to Leo. I explained that he needed exactly 6 fresh rosebuds steeped in water at precisely 175 degrees for exactly 3 minutes. I emphasized that even a second more or less would ruin it. I demonstrated each step of the process for him, carefully showing him the temperature and the timing. Leo watched me with rapt attention. Just as the familiar floral scent began to fill the room, Olivia walked in. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw her eyes soften as she looked at me. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible hint of vulnerability hidden in the slight curve of her lips. The handover process was proving to be far more difficult than I had anticipated. I had my hands in so many different projects that it was impossible to explain everything in a single conversation. Olivia was famously difficult to please, and every detail of her life required absolute perfection. I had to manage everything from the exact temperature of the studio to the specific feel of the fabric for her gowns. I eventually bought a notebook and began documenting every single detail for my successor. I essentially wrote a survival guide for whoever would take my place. This caused the transition period to drag on well past our initial 1-month goal. This delay pushed me into the one situation I had been desperate to avoid, which was accompanying Ethan Harrison to the Sterling estate. I still harbored feelings for Olivia that were inappropriate, even though I had never acted on them. The thought of facing the man she was going to marry filled me with a strange sense of guilt. Ethan Harrison arrived looking every bit the successful mogul in a bespoke suit and a Patek Philippe watch. His hair was perfectly styled, and he radiated an air of confidence. I forced a professional smile as I stepped forward to greet him. I told him that Olivia had sent me to pick him up. Throughout the drive, he kept plying me with questions about her. He was visibly anxious about getting engaged to a woman he barely knew. I noticed his discomfort and gave him what I hoped was a reassuring smile. I assured him that Olivia was a very kind person and that he had nothing to worry about. I told him he could reach out to me anytime if he had questions. He gave me a look of genuine gratitude. We made small talk during the journey about the estate and the music industry. My plan was to drop him off at the Sterling mansion and make a quick exit. To my surprise, Olivia's grandmother, Matilda Sterling, insisted that I stay. Even in her 70s, she remained a legend in the music world with eyes that were sharp enough to peer into a person's soul. She asked me where Olivia was. Olivia was nowhere to be found, so I maintained a stoic expression while lying that her rehearsal schedule had been changed. I told Mrs. Sterling that her granddaughter would be arriving a bit later than expected. Matilda let out a cold snort and ordered me to bring Olivia home at once. I remembered seeing her punish Olivia by forcing her to practice for 6 hours straight until her fingers bled. Small scars from those sessions were still visible on Olivia's fingertips to this day. As soon as I was clear of the estate, I started calling her. I was relieved when she finally picked up on the 3rd attempt. I demanded to know where she was. There was a long pause before she finally spoke my name. Her voice was slurred, and she sounded completely intoxicated. I could hear a piano playing in the background and knew exactly where to find her. When I burst into the dimly lit jazz club, I saw her leaning against a grand piano. There was a long line of half-empty whiskey glasses sitting in front of her. Her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like silk in the low light. She looked up when she heard my footsteps approaching. Her eyes were unfocused, yet she still maintained her typical air of cold detachment. Even in her drunken state, she appeared composed and distant. She told me I had arrived just as she was finishing her piece. She patted the seat next to her and asked me to sit and talk for a while. The Sterling family's music hall was located in one of the most expensive parts of the city. The building was a masterpiece of European architecture that sat like a jewel in the heart of New York. Olivia asked me if I thought it was beautiful. I was staring at the sharp line of her jaw and blurted out my agreement before I could stop myself. I felt my face flush with heat as soon as the words left my mouth. She didn't seem to notice as she continued to stare out the window. She remarked with a touch of self-mockery that all the glamour was just a way to decorate a cage. She said that no stage was grand enough to imprison a truly free heart. There were countless rumors surrounding the Sterling family's empire. Most people were aware that their rise to power involved some very questionable business deals. I had spent the last decade watching her climb to the very top of the music world. No one else could truly imagine the level of sacrifice she had made to get there. I found myself asking her if she was actually happy. She let the word happy linger on her lips for a moment, as if she were tasting it. Instead of answering me, she simply laughed and told me that my fiancé was not good enough for me. I was completely stunned by her remark. She quickly looked down and apologized, saying she shouldn't have said something so personal. She finished her drink and stood up to leave. In an instant, she transformed back into the elegant Olivia the world knew. She was once again the poised and professional pianist. As we drove back, her words about my fiancé kept echoing in my mind. I couldn't wrap my head around what she meant by that comment. It was just another mystery, much like why she had been on that rooftop all those years ago. None of that mattered anymore, because I was finally leaving her world. Our paths would no longer cross after today. On my final day, the sky opened up with a heavy downpour. The rain hammered against the pavement as if trying to wash away all my bottled-up emotions. I sat in the office next to the studio and began packing up my things. I had occupied this small space for nearly 10 years. I had walked into this office as a clueless kid and was leaving as a man who could handle anything. I knew exactly how the afternoon sun would hit the Steinway piano at 3 o'clock every day. I knew the exact spot in the room where I could hear the faint sound of her breath between notes. These small, stolen moments had been the most cherished parts of my life for a long time. It was finally time to leave those memories behind. I had repaid my debt of 10 years, and now it was Ethan Harrison's turn to take care of her. Leo stood by the door with tears in his eyes. I reached out to ruffle his hair and told him with a smile that this wasn't forever. Deep down, I knew that this truly was the end of the road for me here. This city was filled with too many painful memories, and I desperately needed a fresh start. As I left the studio, a small, childish part of me hoped I might see her one last time. She never showed up. I spent the first few days after my resignation locked in my apartment, sleeping for hours on end. It felt as though I was finally catching up on a decade of lost rest. I bought a bottle of whiskey and blasted Olivia's recordings on a loop. I started laughing, but the sound was hollow and sharp as it echoed through the empty rooms of my apartment. Once I stopped laughing, I just sat on the floor staring at piles of sheet music. As a child, my only reason for living was the belief that my father wouldn't jump as long as I was okay. After he died, I dedicated myself to working as hard as possible to keep my mother from leaving. When she eventually abandoned me anyway, I threw every ounce of my energy into my career. My only goal in life had been to sustain Olivia's career. Now that she was gone, I felt completely lost. I was spiraling into my memories when the sound of the doorbell suddenly startled me. I looked through the peephole and felt my heart skip a beat when I saw Olivia standing there. I scrambled to open the door, only then realizing how disheveled I looked. It was too late to pretend I wasn't home. I opened the door and tried to force a professional smile despite my obvious panic. In contrast to my messy state, Olivia looked perfectly composed and elegant. She told me she had tried calling and needed a backup file for a program change for tonight's performance. She claimed she was in the neighborhood and decided to stop by in person. I tried to steady my breathing and invited her in while I searched for the files. I was breaking a sweat as I dug through my paperwork, while Olivia sat calmly with the tea I had prepared for her. I could feel her eyes following my every move. Her intense gaze made my hand shake as I searched. Naturally, the more I panicked, the harder it was to find the documents. Olivia told me to relax and take my time. Out of nowhere, she asked if my fiancé lived with me. The question caught me completely off guard. I stammered out a lie about her working late tonight. After another few minutes of searching, I finally found the file and handed it over. Olivia took the papers but kept her eyes on my face for several seconds before looking down. Her intense stare made my heart race uncontrollably. I was about to speak when she gave me a strange smile and announced her upcoming wedding. She said she needed someone reliable to coordinate the event and asked if I would be willing to help. She offered to pay me my previous salary for the job. I had never been able to say no to her, and my body agreed before my mind could object. As I watched her walk away, my unspoken thoughts dissolved into a silent sigh. I found myself back on her team, this time as her wedding coordinator. I hoped that seeing her walk down the aisle would finally give me the closure I needed to move on. My guilt toward Ethan drove me to be a perfectionist in every aspect of the planning. I obsessed over every detail, determined to give Olivia the most flawless wedding possible. One of the key people in the wedding was acting like a ghost, skipping almost every meeting and fitting. All of her decisions were relayed through me, as if she were trying to distance herself from the entire event. The whole thing felt less like a wedding and more like a mandatory ritual she was forced to endure. Ethan's mood grew darker with each passing day. While he was getting fitted for his suit, he looked at me with a look of absolute, soul-crushing despair. He asked if I could find out if she was planning to show up that day. I knew it wasn't my place to get involved, but I couldn't ignore how broken he looked. I decided to call Olivia. The background of the call was very loud, and Olivia sounded completely exhausted. I almost hung up, but then I remembered the hopeful look in Ethan's eyes. I carefully told her that the wedding dress had arrived and asked if she wanted to see it. There was a long pause before she finally agreed and asked me to come pick her up. I couldn't understand why she insisted on me picking her up, but I did as I was told. When I arrived at the club, she was the only person left, staring blankly out the window. I walked up to her quietly and called her name. She turned toward me, and for a split second, her eyes held an emotion I couldn't quite identify. The raw vulnerability in her gaze made me stop in my tracks. Just as quickly, she put her cold, distant mask back on, leaving me wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. I helped her into the car, and we sat in silence for the entire drive. She kept her eyes closed in the back seat, as if she were trying to block out the rest of the world. I took the rare opportunity to look at her through the rearview mirror, letting my gaze linger a little too long. The thought of Ethan brought back a fresh wave of guilt. I looked away and focused on the road, but a sudden, chilling sense of unease washed over me. I've always trusted my gut, and my mind started racing as I realized something was definitely wrong. A black SUV had been tailing us for 30 minutes, maintaining a very suspicious distance. I tried to wake Olivia up, but she was sound asleep in the back and didn't respond. I had no other choice, so I slammed my foot down on the accelerator. The other car had clearly been modified because I couldn't shake it no matter how fast I went. Suddenly, the black SUV swerved and slammed into the side of our vehicle. The force of the impact sent our car into a violent spin. I fought with the steering wheel, barely managing to keep us from flying off the edge of the cliff. My vision was a blur of motion as the sound of shattering glass filled the air. My vision turned a dark shade of crimson and my head was pounding, but I forced myself to crawl out of the wreckage. Olivia was awake now, but she was trapped in the back seat and struggling to move. The metal frame of the car had crumpled inward and pinned her down. I grabbed a tire iron from the trunk and tried to pry the door open, but the damage was too severe. I could smell gasoline leaking from the tank, and smoke was beginning to fill the cabin. In that moment of life or death, my mind became incredibly focused. My only objective was to get Olivia out of that car. The flames were spreading fast. Olivia told me, with surprising calmness, that her salary wasn't worth me dying for. She begged me to leave before the car exploded. Her words grated on my raw nerves like sandpaper. I snapped at her to shut up and kept working. She gave me a strange smile, but I didn't have the time to figure out what it meant. The flames grew higher as they began to lick the sides of the car. Blood was dripping from the gash on my arm as I gritted my teeth and put every ounce of strength I had into the task. After a desperate struggle of prying and pulling, I finally managed to drag her free from the wreckage. I hauled her away as we stumbled as fast as we could. We had only made a short distance when a massive explosion rocked the area behind us. A giant fireball lit up the night sky with a violent orange glow. I felt a wave of relief that I hadn't skipped the gym over the last few years. If I hadn't been in shape, neither of us would have made it out alive. I could hear the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. A wave of bone-deep exhaustion washed over me, and I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness. Olivia was the first one to wake up in the hospital. She vividly remembered how I had wrenched the steering wheel toward myself at the last second. I had intentionally positioned myself to take the full force of the impact. As she sat in the hospital room watching me sleep, she felt as if she were seeing me for the very first time. She had been betrayed so many times throughout her life. When she was kidnapped as a child, Her own father had pushed her aside to save himself. He had abandoned her and left her at the mercy of the kidnappers. Her mother had promised to always be there for her, yet she eventually took her own life with a piano string. Everyone she had ever known had eventually walked away. This had taught her that she could only ever rely on herself. Yet here I was, the man who had every reason to save himself, choosing to stay and protect her instead. She usually prided herself on being a good judge of character, but she couldn't understand my motivations. She wondered what was going through my head. I slowly drifted back to consciousness and found Olivia staring at me. My heart raced as I worried she might have figured out my secret feelings. She was looking at me with such intensity that my palms began to sweat. She finally asked me why I had saved her life. I thought fast and forced a smile, telling her that I was a gambler at heart. I joked that the chance to have a world-class pianist owe me her life was too good an opportunity to pass up. She frowned as she tried to determine if I was telling the truth. In her social circles, people who claimed to want nothing were the most dangerous. She felt much more comfortable with people who were upfront about their price. I quickly tried to think of a demand that would seem reasonable in exchange for saving her life. I finally came up with an answer that I knew would put her mind at ease. I told her I wanted the exclusive management rights for her next album, noting that the commission alone would set me up for life. I noticed her shoulders relax slightly, and I knew I had played my cards right. She gave a self-deprecating laugh and suggested that an album was too intangible. She offered to set me up with my own music store in Midtown instead. I laughed with her and told her that I would be happy to accept a multi-million-dollar storefront. Now that we had made a deal, she no longer had to feel like she was in my debt. She stood up and reverted to her usual cold demeanor. She told me to focus on my recovery and said I would no longer be needed for the engagement party plans. I spent a week in the hospital and was discharged on the very day of the engagement. The media was absolutely saturated with stories about the union of the Sterling and Harrison families. The concert hall had been transformed into a fairy tale setting with massive crystal chandeliers illuminating the room. This was where our story was supposed to end. After today, we would go our separate ways. I couldn't ignore the dull ache in my chest as I walked through the city streets. Eventually, I found myself ducking into a quiet cocktail bar to hide from the world. I was always the one cleaning up after everyone else, so I rarely allowed myself to lose control. I ordered a whiskey on the rocks and felt the liquid burn its way down my throat. People say you drink to forget, but the bitterness only seemed to bring me to tears. My tears fell into the glass, mixing with the alcohol until it felt like a cocktail made of regret. My vision began to blur as I fumbled for my phone to call for a ride. I emphasized to the dispatcher that the driver needed to get me home safely. Meanwhile, at the engagement party, Olivia received an unexpected call from me. It provided her with the perfect excuse to escape the stifling atmosphere of her own engagement. When she arrived at the bar, the driver greeted her and explained that I was extremely intoxicated. He told her I couldn't even give him my address, so he called the most frequent contact in my phone. The driver looked at her nervously and hoped she wasn't my boss. Fearing a complaint once, I sobered up. Olivia took hold of me and calmly assured him that she would take care of everything. She helped me out of the bar while I acted like a restless child. I kept reaching out to touch her face and messing with her hair as she led me away. Olivia had never seen me so completely vulnerable. She felt a surge of curiosity and decided to ask why I had stayed with her for so long. I muttered under my breath with a foolish but innocent smile that I was just repaying a debt. She asked what debt I was referring to, and I told her it was because she had saved my life. She pressed me further, asking how I planned to repay it. I told her I wanted to give her every beautiful thing in the world. When she asked why I cared so much, I simply told her it was because I loved her. Olivia had studied psychology at Juilliard and was skilled at getting people to talk. She had been searching for an answer for a long time, but she never expected the truth to be that I was in love with her. She looked closely at me in my drunken state. My smile was clumsy yet sincere, and even though my eyes were glazed over, there wasn't a hint of dishonesty in them. Countless men had confessed their love to her over the years. However, She had never encountered a love like mine, one that had been hidden so deeply for so long that no one else in the world knew it existed. Suddenly, all the small details she had noticed over the years began to make sense. She finally understood why there had never been a trace of another woman in my life. Olivia became quiet as she retreated into her thoughts. She wondered if she could truly trust a love so profound that a man would die for her without a second thought. My head felt like it was going to explode when I woke up the next morning. The remnants of my dreams were still vivid, and the only thing I could clearly remember were her eyes shining like starlight. I cursed myself for still dreaming about her. It was absolutely wrong to have such fantasies about a woman who was already engaged to someone else. I spent the next few months avoiding the news entirely. I packed a bag and took a train across the country, wandering through dozens of unfamiliar cities. I visited single-parent families who were struggling and used my savings to help them get by. I often wondered if my mother's life would have been different if someone had reached out to help us back then. The world was full of suffering, and I just wanted to do my part to help people. Then one day, a piece of news hit me like a bombshell. Olivia Sterling had announced her retirement from the music world. The newspapers ran a photo of her and Ethan that had been dramatically torn in half. The headlines were full of speculation about why she was quitting at the height of her career. My hands were trembling as I dialed Ethan's number. He sounded exhausted and explained that it was a business decision made by the families. He told me that their personal feelings were irrelevant and there was nothing he could do. Once I hung up, my heart rate began to return to normal. I started to realize that this was likely a carefully orchestrated exit strategy that Olivia had been planning for years. She had spent years wearing a mask for the cameras, but I had always seen her exhaustion. The fame she had achieved had become a golden cage that was slowly suffocating her. I had attempted to talk to her about her career before, but she always changed the subject. It appeared she had been planning her escape for a very long time. I remembered her vulnerability when she was drunk and how she had called her life a cage. I realized that what she needed now was an anchor, someone to provide her with warmth and stability. I wanted to be there for her, just like she had been there for me on that rooftop. This thought energized me, and I rushed to her studio as fast as I could. The building that was once a hub of activity was now dark and silent. She had used her remaining funds to provide severance for all of her staff. I walked down the eerily quiet hallway and pushed open the door to her private studio. She was sitting at the piano with her face hidden in the shadows. The wind whistled through the cracks in the window, causing the curtains to rustle with a mournful sound. She looked up at me with an expression that was impossible to decipher. It was as if she were carrying the weight of the entire world. I reached out slowly and took her hand in mine. All the speeches I had practiced in my head vanished the moment I felt the warmth of her hand. My only desire was to hold on to her just as she had held onto me all those years ago. Her mind drifted back to her mother, a brilliant artist who had been crushed by the demands of high society. She had ended up as nothing more than a tragic footnote in the history of music. They had tried to turn a pure soul into a commercial product. They had forced her to play a role and compromise her integrity for the sake of success. Everyone had pushed her mother closer and closer to the edge. They claimed she lacked business sense and didn't deserve her success. She began to wonder if the problem was actually the system itself rather than her mother. The Sterling family was still secretly involved in illegal copyright deals. This was a dark secret that they had fought hard to keep hidden from the public. Her mother had discovered the corruption and tried to expose it, but she was destroyed by their lies instead. She was slowly consumed by the very system she tried to fight. Olivia had intended to carry that burden alone and let the secrets die with her. That all changed when I showed up. She wondered if my devotion was truly driven by love. She had seen me from the window as soon as I arrived. While everyone else was leaving, I was the only one pushing my way through the crowd. I walked across the room, stepping over the scattered sheet music to get to her. I reminded her of a knight from a storybook rushing into a fire to save a princess. The thought made her smile, and she wondered how anyone could be so foolish. I walked up to her and took her hand in mine. I felt a steady warmth radiating from my palm. Olivia suddenly realized just how cold her own hands had become. She gripped my hand tightly, finding comfort in my presence amidst the chaos. I stayed by her side and helped her through the process of closing down her studio. Angry fans threw eggs at the stage during her final press conference. The public was demanding answers from the Sterling family and needed someone to blame. It was a price she was willing to pay for her freedom. On the night of her announcement, her father, the head of the Sterling Empire, suffered a massive stroke. She invited me over for a drink that same evening. I was surprised to find that she wanted to meet at her private studio. I hesitated at the door, feeling that it might be too intimate a setting. We had never socialized like this before. The privacy of the situation made me feel out of place. Olivia sat there with her head down, looking incredibly lonely. Her voice sounded thick when she finally spoke. I wondered if she had been crying for her father despite everything. I felt a sharp pang of sympathy for her. I took the bottle of wine from her and saw her eyes light up slightly. I decided to stay and have a drink with her since patience had always been my strongest suit. I had never seen her looking so disheveled. Her black dress was wrinkled and her hair was a mess. She looked so fragile that I feared she might break if a strong wind caught her. She was usually the epitome of grace and poise, the center of attention wherever she went. Now, however, she looked like a fallen angel who had finally touched the ground. She kept calling my name in her drunken state and insisted that I answer her each time. Her voice was soft and alluring, and every time she spoke, it felt like a hammer against my heart. She leaned in so close that we were only inches apart. The moonlight caught her eyelashes and cast delicate shadows across her face. She whispered my name and asked if I would stay with her forever. I didn't know how to respond because a lifetime seemed like such a long time to commit to. I reminded myself that I was just her manager, but she was as persistent as a child who wouldn't take no for an answer. I finally whispered that I would always be by her side. She finally calmed down after hearing my promise, but then she complained about being too hot. She ran a hand through her hair and exposed her pale, elegant neck. The movement was entirely natural, yet it felt incredibly seductive. I had never imagined that I would one day find Olivia Sterling to be so alluring. I looked away after a moment, but she kept moving closer to me. I felt my face start to burn even though it was a freezing winter night. The room felt incredibly small and stifling. I forced myself to pull away and create some distance between us. She looked at me with confusion before returning to her drink until the bottle was empty. She stared at me with what looked like encouragement right before she passed out. I couldn't understand why she was looking at me like that. I put her to bed and then went back to my own apartment. I spent the entire night tossing and turning, trying to figure out what her expression meant. She called me the next day to thank me for taking care of her. I told her it was just part of my job, which led to a long silence on her end. She sounded like she was gritting her teeth when she told me I was being impossible. She hung up before she could finish her sentence, leaving me totally baffled. Once the studio was closed down, there was no longer any professional reason for us to see each other. The days began to blur together until she showed up at my door drunk again one night. She collapsed into my arms the moment I opened the door. I managed to get her onto the sofa and was about to leave when she grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward her. I lost my footing and fell directly against her. We were so close that I could feel her breath on my face. She looked into my eyes and whispered my name. My name sounded different when she said it, and it sent shivers down my spine. I could see my own reflection in her eyes, and for a moment, I felt like the only person in her world. The sound of my own heart was pounding in my ears like a drum. Our breath mingled in the tiny space between us. I found myself leaning toward her as if drawn by an invisible force. When our lips finally met, any lingering sense of logic I had left completely vanished. Every ounce of self-control I had built up over the years melted away in the warmth of her kiss. I fled the apartment like a coward the moment the sun began to rise. I was half a block away before I realized that I had run away from my own home. I spent the entire day wandering the streets until it was dark again. I eventually crept back to my apartment and tried to open the door as quietly as possible. The lights suddenly flickered on and blinded me for a second. Olivia was still sitting on the sofa with one eyebrow raised. She asked me if I was the kind of man who just disappears after a night together. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of whether to come in or run away again. She told me to come over so we could have a proper conversation. I started to explain that last night was a mistake driven by impulse, but she cut me off. She told me that I always made things worse when I talked and insisted on speaking first. She looked more serious than I had ever seen her, and my heart began to race in anticipation. She told me that I saw her as some perfect, untouchable figure, but that she was just a regular person. She admitted that she had desires and felt jealousy just like anyone else. I tried to protest, but she silenced me by saying she knew I was confused and that it was unfair to make me choose right now. However, she admitted that she was too afraid to give me time to think it over. She confessed her fear that I would stop loving her once I saw all of her flaws. She said she didn't care if my feelings were driven by love, gratitude, or even idolization. She told me that I had already turned her life upside down and that I had no right to just walk away. She pulled a small box from her pocket and opened it to reveal a stunning diamond ring. Her eyes were even more brilliant than the diamond as she asked me to spend the rest of my life with her. My mind went completely blank, and I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I nodded purely by instinct without even realizing I was saying yes. A soft, genuine smile spread across her face as she slid the ring onto my finger. She asked if I had my ID with her. I nodded once again. Her smile grew wider as she told me we were leaving. I asked her where we were going. We walked down the steps of City Hall just as the sun was beginning to set, each of us holding our new marriage license. We had been the very last couple to be served that day. The sky was a brilliant display of red and gold, looking as if it were on fire. In that moment, the anxiety and confusion that had haunted me for so long finally vanished. This story isn't about sacrifice or unrequited love. It's about the quiet moment when you finally realize that you don't have to keep giving until you're empty. Liam spent 10 years believing he was repaying a debt, but what he never understood was that saving someone and loving someone are not the same thing. He thought walking away was the only way to protect himself, but Catherine had to break her own walls down to show him that he was never just an employee, never just a placeholder. The truth is, love doesn't have to be earned through suffering. You don't have to prove your worth by how much you can endure. Sometimes the person who saves your life isn't the one you owe. They're the one who stays when they have every reason to leave. And the hardest, bravest thing you can do isn't holding on. It's finally letting yourself believe that you are allowed to be happy, not as a reward for your pain, but simply because you are here.